In general, I'm not a lectionary preacher. In fact, my favorite way to select sermon topics is to ask the congregations that I serve, what do you want to hear sermons about? And then I preach on those things. I have every intention of asking you that question come the fall. So you might begin thinking about that, jotting down some notes. You will get the question, and then there will always be like a box or some place where you can anonymously say, I want to hear about this or that. But right now, I'm preparing this sermon before I've even begun as your pastor. It's still July here in this video. So I figured I would reach into the lectionary to see what it might be serving up for the first Sunday of August. I couldn't believe it. Right there on Sunday, August 2nd, was a Bible story that has resonated throughout my adult life. It's even part of my email address. Not only is the wrestling match at the Jabbok River a touchstone story for me, it also happens to be a story that couldn't be more fitting for our times as a world, a nation, a denomination, and a local church. Ultimately, this story is about identity and conflict, theft and atonement. It's about broken relationships, fear, anger, the ways that we often resist grace, and what real courage looks like. It's about our attempts at easy fixes and God stepping in to make sure that we do the real work. It's about being willing to fully empty ourselves and to take on hardship in order to receive and to become a channel for God's blessing. It's about wrestling with our enemies until we can finally see, even in them, the face of God. One of the reasons that I usually don't like the lectionary is that it leaves out too much. The passage we heard earlier is all you get for this story, which is not nearly enough. Context is really important, and especially here. The whole reason that Jacob is having this wrestling match at all is because his twin brother, Esau, is on the other side of the river with 400 armed men coming to kill him. That's a pretty important piece of information, if you ask me. So we are going to take 2 weeks with the story itself. This week is going to be about how we got here, and next week will be about what happens next. And then we're going to take the rest of August and maybe longer to do our own wrestling around questions of identity. Who are we as human beings, and why are we here? When we talk about God and being God's people, who is that God exactly? What are the identifying marks of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be the church? We'll wrestle with who we are as United Methodists and who we are as a local congregation situated in a very particular and very fraught time and place in history. Jacob's wrestling match resonates deeply enough that it might even be a touchstone for our entire first year together. So if you're willing, let's explore who Jacob is, how he got to this place, and why it is he's having this difficult moment at the ford of the Jabbok River. Next week, we'll look at what happens to him on the other side. To begin with, Jacob is Abraham's grandson. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And the very first story we get about him in the Bible tells us that there has been a struggle between Jacob and his twin brother Esau from the get-go. Their mother, Rebekah, has difficulty conceiving. And the first thing we learn about the two, before they are even born, is that Rebekah felt so much struggle even in the womb. Their kicking it out and doing their thing, that she went to God to say, what gives, God? What is going on here in my body? This does not feel normal. And she was told by God in Genesis 25, verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. When Rebekah finally goes into labor, it's Esau who emerges first, and thus is technically the firstborn. But Jacob is right behind him, and the Bible tells us he was born literally grabbing onto Esau's heel as he came out, which is how he got his name. The name Jacob means heel grabber. It's come to further mean usurper. Esau means hairy, so you can imagine the baby pictures. So we know from the start where the Bible is taking us and what's going, sort of foreshadowing of what's to come. And when their father, Isaac, is blind and getting on in years and it's time to pass the torch, we get the next significant conflict between the twins. Being the firstborn in ancient Hebrew culture was a big deal, as it still is in many cultures today. Since Esau holds that position, he's entitled to a greater share of the inheritance and also to a special blessing from his father. The short version of their early adult conflict is that Jacob exploits his brother to take the inheritance and then works with his mother, Rebekah, on an elaborate scheme of deception to steal the blessing by literally dressing up as his brother Esau, hairy body and all, to trick blind Isaac into giving the blessing that was intended for Esau to Jacob instead. There are no do-overs for such things. Kind of once the blessing was out there, it was given, and Isaac couldn't take it back, even if it was fraudulently obtained. And Esau is beside himself with grief and rage, as you might imagine. So he plots to kill Jacob. Rebekah learns of it, and moms always liked Jacob best, and so she strongly suggests that Jacob go for a long visit far away to see Rebekah's brother Laban and try to find himself a wife while he's there. Once Jacob gets to his uncle Laban's home, we see that scheming does indeed run in the family. For several chapters, Laban and Jacob steal and deceive each other over Laban's daughters, Jacob's work, and who properly owns what after Jacob has done labor for his uncle. There's even some weird magical stuff with spotted sheep. It's quite the assortment of stories, and you should really sometime just read it all. But Jacob's last grab is to take the wealth that he believes is his, pack up all that with 2 of Laban's daughters, 2 of their handmaids, the 11 children that he's had with all of them, and make a run for it while Laban is away shearing his sheep. One of Jacob's wives, Rachel, even steals her father's household gods. Then they quite literally head for the hills, in this case the hill country of Gilead, aiming for the Jordan River and a return to Jacob's home. It's been more than 14 years since Jacob has seen his twin, but Jacob appears to think that everything's cool with Esau now and he's willing to let bygones be bygones. So Jacob sends messengers to his brother to say, "Hey, guess what? It's Jacob, and I'm really rich now, and I'm coming home. Want to come see me?" What could possibly go wrong? The messengers return to Jacob and say, "Sir, Esau is coming to meet you, and he's got 400 armed men with him." So this is not good. Jacob wasn't exactly nimble with his entourage. Being rich in ancient times didn't involve lugging around a stack of gold or sticking a sack of gold on a donkey or something. Most wealth for the Hebrews was the donkey. It was measured in flocks and herds. Jacob is in the hill country with 2 wives, 2 handmaids, 11 children, and at least 1,000 goats, sheep, camels, cows, and donkeys, as well as a whole horde of servants who tend to them and drive them and help keep them together. You don't just dodge an approaching army of 400 men with all of that in the hills. So Jacob first divides everything he's got into 2 groups, figuring, well, if Esau finds one group and slaughters them, maybe while he's busy doing that, the other group can escape. He then sort of has a foxhole prayer, asking God to save him from his brother, and if he'll do that, he'll be faithful and serve him forever and all that stuff that we do in foxhole prayers. And then he gets back to practical matters. Whether he's actually trying to atone or whether it's simply self-preservation, we aren't told. But Jacob does try to right the wrongs done to his brother so long ago. Jacob stole 2 main things from Esau: his inheritance and his blessing, basically wealth and status. So he spends the day preparing gifts of wealth, totaling 550 livestock, we're told in the Bible exactly what he gave him, and sends them in waves, one after the other, to his brother, each with servants who come bowing and scraping and saying, "Your servant Jacob sends these to you." It's a reparations of sorts, giving back the inheritance he stole with the livestock and returning status by presenting himself to Esau as Esau's servant. So that is the full context as twilight falls and the passage we heard initially opens. Jacob, his family, and the rest of the entourage move into the ford of the Jabbok River, which is a tributary to the Jordan, surrounded by hills. And here the story moves from being a concrete narrative about a particular family conflict to a more mystical story that's filled with symbol and metaphor. And we should always pay attention to those. The ford of a river is a liminal space. It's neither here nor there. In the ford, Jacob isn't really on one side of the river or the other. He doesn't keep everyone else in that limbo. He sends his family and all the rest of the flocks and the herds and the servants fully across the river. But Jacob stays in the ford, which is exactly where he is in his life. He no longer belongs to the life with his uncle Laban, which is behind him. And it's not looking good for his homecoming on the other side either. He has a promise that God will be with him, given to him once in a dream. But he's not exactly lived the life of a spiritual hero. Does God's promise still hold, or does it end here? The days of pretending to be his brother are over. He can't go back, and he's afraid to go forward. The word Jabbok in Hebrew, Jabbok, means emptying. And that's exactly what Jacob is experiencing here. All his family and wealth has crossed over. He's given back to Esau the status he once sold. He's burned the bridges with his uncle behind him, and Esau wants to kill him ahead. In this moment, Jacob is empty of wealth, family, status, and relationship. He is, in every sense, alone. And he sits in the neither here nor there space of the ford of the Jabbok River, the emptying river, as night falls, contemplating how he ended up here, perhaps on the last night of his life. A man comes from where we're not told. Some Jewish traditions say it was the guardian angel of Esau, which adds an even richer layer of meaning to the story. They begin to wrestle, and the struggle continues throughout the entire night. By morning, Jacob has a new name, Israel. He's convinced the man was God, and he has finally earned his own blessing instead of just taking the blessing that belonged to his brother. It has cost Jacob. He has to limp across the river as he finally crosses. But he does so with a new identity and a much deeper understanding of grace. I don't know whether this story is factual, and in a real sense, I don't care. What I do know is that this story is deeply true. If you haven't yet found yourself in the ford of the Jabbok, a place in life where you're unable to go back and afraid to go forward, wrestling down past events and praying what it seems like into the void for help. If you haven't yet been there, you will. Or, at least for the sake of your spiritual growth, you should. My own Jabbok River moment came on my first night in a small apartment in Atlanta. Newly divorced and about to start seminary, I'd sold everything I had of value to get into the ford. My French horn and the grand piano I had inherited from my great aunt for whom I was named, sold. My mother's silver, sold. My wedding dress, sold at a consignment shop. Not that it held many good memories anymore. My ex-husband got the dogs that I loved with my whole heart because I couldn't have pets in my new apartment. People dear to me had helped me move, but they'd gone home. And I sat on an unmade bed surrounded by boxes and just sobbed. I looked into the mirror and there was nobody looking back at me. Literally all I had was the memory that as a child of 14, I had stood in the pulpit of my home church to preach for Youth Sunday and had finished with the sure sense that God was calling me to do that for the rest of my life. And so there I was. I didn't know a soul. Classes wouldn't begin for another week. And all I could do was pray that God was still with me, even though it didn't really feel like that was true. Who was I? Why was I here? What lay on the other side of that emptying river? I wrestled with that for 2 solid years, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Like Jacob, I came out limping, but blessed. But the story is much bigger than our individual struggles. Jacob and Esau don't just represent individual brothers. As God's first words to Rebekah indicate, they are also nations, Israel and Edom, who are the descendants of Esau. While both are grandsons of Abraham, they're also different faiths. Esau married Canaanite women and one of the daughters of Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael. Jacob married women within the Hebrew people. The Bible is never just about our behavior and issues as individuals, not in either testament. The Bible's message is about who we are together as families, as faith communities, societies, nations, and ultimately as a human species, charged in Genesis with protecting an earth that is teeming with all life. Figuring out those identities, both separately and together, is the work of a lifetime. But the key to beginning that work is here at the Jabbok River, the tributary river whose only job is to empty itself into a larger flow. Jesus taught us that if we want to live, we have to be willing to die. This story teaches us the same thing. What does that get us? What happens when we summon the courage to empty ourselves and cross the river? That's next week's sermon, and I'll see you then.